This is a recording for the CUPHAT project. My name is Chris McCann. Today is the 8th of June 2023 and I have with me here CUPHAT Gallagher. Thank you, CUPHAT. Can you confirm for the recorder that you are happy to take part in this project?
I'm very happy to be involved, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to do so.
Great, thank you. Could you spell your name for the recorder, please?
S-I Father O-F-R-A. Gallagher, G-A-L-L-A-G-H-E-R.
Okay, so I think to start off with, obviously you've been very connected with this community for a long, long time. Perhaps if you could tell us, what are your earliest memories of growing up around here?
I suppose my earliest childhood memories would be a sense of freedom. Basically, we were reared in a home. I had 3 siblings, and the home was very free. We were allowed to wander. Again, it was very typical of children back in the late 50s, early 60s. We walked to school, we walked home. So if you wandered into the fields, that was no problem. There was a resilience inculcated in us from a very young age. And I suppose that has stood to us in our life. All my siblings, ironically, have all moved back to living in Tinnahealy, having grown up and having had a very rich childhood here. And that sense of freedom was very important for us. We didn't realise it at the time. I suppose as a primary principal of 43 years, I see now there is a different way of that children have. They don't have, I suppose, the freedoms that we had for very different reasons and a different culture and a different time they're growing up in than compared to where we grew up. We had a sense of, my father was an artist, a landscape artist, and he used to often say, and I have the bills to prove it. Because, of course, who was buying art in the early 60s? But he had a wider world vision. Because my father was a Dunleary man. My mother was a Clare woman, so it was East meeting West. They met in Dunleary and married shortly afterwards. And the 3 of myself and my 2 siblings were born in Monkstown Hospital. And we grew up, we had our first years, I had 2 years in Monkstown. Then my father, as he was owned a garage at the time, himself and his brother-in-law were the first to bring in Volkswagen into Ireland, just after the war. And they had to basically introduce it as a sales, first time to sell a car in the country. A Volkswagen car in the country. So anyway, business for one reason or another went by the wayside after 6 or 7 years. So my father then decided, look, he was going to head out to Australia. And he was going to bring the family with him. But in those days, you went out, you kind of bought your passage, and you had to be out for maybe a year before you actually find your feet. So he went out, and within a very short time, my mother started to sell up the house in Monkstown and make plans to transfer to Melbourne. Within a few months, she got letters from my dad, again, letters in those days, no mobile phones, obviously, to say no, he wasn't going to bring his children up in Melbourne. He did not think it was a very suitable place. So he told her he was moving back, and my mother at that point had sold the house, had sold everything, furniture, everything, and thought, what am I going to do? So she looked up the newspaper and discovered that there was a place, there was a hairdressing salon for rent in a place called Tinnahealy that she had never heard of, being a woman from the west, from County Clare. So she duly rang the person who was renting, came down with her sister-in-law and took the business over herself, single-handedly. And then we were eventually brought down, myself and my 2 siblings. I was 2, my sister was 4, and my brother was 8 months. As you can imagine, a woman arriving with 3 small children under the ages of 2 and under, without a husband in 1957 was quite a cause célèbre in Tinnahealy. But my mother, being a very private woman, kept to herself, and she set about getting the premises that she had hired on Barton Street, Tinnahealy, named after the figure, a very famous figure in Irish history, Robert Barton. She set about setting up a business and getting her clients, because she was a hairdresser before she married my dad. My dad arrived back after about 9 months. Now, bear in mind, my dad had fought in the Burma War, in the Second World War. When he was 18, he was a student in Blackrock College, but he wasn't a very academic student. And my grandfather, Chris O'Brien, used to say to him, "Dennis, the only exam you'll ever pass is the post-mortem." But that was the sense of humour in our household, in their household. My grandfather owned a hotel on the Marine Road called the Avoca Hotel on the Marine Road in Dunleary. And he would have loved my father to continue in the business. But instead, my father, being a bit of a rebel, at the age of 18, unknown to my grandfather, he went up north and joined the British Air Force. Now, my grandfather was a customs officer in Dunleary, had been stationed in Cork and then moved to Dunleary. And he would have had a lot of contact with the various English diplomats coming back and forth on the mailboat from England to Dunleary, and befriended Churchill's secretary. Churchill was Prime Minister at the time during the Second World War, and when he realised his son had absconded and gone north to join, there was nothing very much he could do, because he was immediately recruited as a trainee mechanic for the British Air Force. So my grandfather then decided, right, how can I try and make sure, unknown to my son, to make him safe? So he used whatever influence he had to make sure that my father actually never left the hangar, and that in Burma he was there to repair the planes that came in. So that was his experience for 4 years. He received medals for his bravery and his contribution. Came back and, as I say, settled with this garage business in the early 50s with his brother-in-law, brought in the Volkswagen car, etc. And again, unsettled, very unsettled, decided then to head to Melbourne once he was married with 3 small children. Came back, and my mother, as I say, had set up the business here in Tinnahealy, and he had come from Melbourne 2 or 3 days earlier, how long it took on the mailboat. It was much longer at the time, I don't know, to arrive in this little place. And he was shocked. I mean, this was such a shock for him. Just getting back to the reason my father was a rebel, I suppose he always wanted to paint. And I mean landscape painting. He got his first lessons from the famous landscape painter Sean Keating in Dublin, and he always wanted to paint. So when he came to Tinnahealy, he was just enamoured with the beauty of the place. This was something he hadn't experienced before. He settled down, and we were reared in the home. My father then got a keen interest in hunting and shooting for the pot, as he said. So in other words, he would, shoot a deer, shoot rabbits, but it was for our food. So we were kind of reared in a very exquisite diet on pheasant and jugged hare and rabbit, and probably a few poached salmon from the nearby Fitzwilliam estate. In fact, he was caught one night poaching salmon, and Lady Fitzwilliam was rewarded for her cautioning him and bringing him to court over it. He painted a rather unflattering painting, a portrait of Lady Fitzwilliam, but that's another story. So my father, anyway, we were reared with a great sense of resilience, and you get on with life. And we had phrases like "oak doesn't bend," you know, whatever challenges life throws up to you, you deal with it. And we were given the skills and to deal with life. And that has stuck to me to this day and to the rest of my siblings. We were very independently minded. So he gave us great example growing up. We didn't have a lot. My father, we didn't have a car. So, we were the only family there were very few families that had cars in the late 50s, early 60s. So my father went from quite a privileged background to living in the country with a very self-sufficient type of lifestyle. He prided himself in his self-sufficiency. He made his own wine he had his own vine growing in a greenhouse which he built himself. He grew his own tobacco. He smoked a pipe once a day in the evening time when he'd finished his work. He also painted. He carved meerschaum pipes from the special meerschaum clay and sold them. He made shillelagh heads, walking sticks from the shillelagh sticks that he would buy locally and sell them, and put heads of famous people in history in Ireland, like the Patriots, Wolfe Tone, and he would carve the head of that character in order to sell them, because he had a market in America. I think he got mentioned in a book called Ireland on $5 a day. And with that, there was a huge interest in him and his lifestyle, because when tour buses would come to Tinahely, they would all want to see my father, Dennis O'Brien, and they would call to see his paintings and maybe perhaps buy some of his souvenirs to bring back to America. And that opened up a very good income for him, because he was selling his paintings abroad. That was towards the middle part of our schooling. It was tricky at the start when he was setting up, and as a landscape painter, who had the money in the early 60s to buy such paintings? But by virtue of his resilience in himself and in hunting our food, it was an unusual existence. But the amazing thing about it is we never felt we were any different. And it's so important for children to feel the same. We never felt we were different. And the very fact that we didn't have a car in the 50s, early 60s probably wasn't too many. But in the 60s, 70s, we didn't have a car. So there was never, we didn't have a car. So we found other ways around it. My father had a huge interest in and an understanding of how children in the country mightn't get the same opportunities, say, to learn a musical instrument. So he would have approached the local senator. We had a Senator Mary Walsh, Fine Gael Senator Mary Walsh, and he would have asked her, look, is there any possibility that we could get maybe some grant funding so that my children could actually learn a musical instrument? And in the days of, maybe there was a little bit of pull and influence, he managed to secure a little grant so that we could actually leave Tinahely once a week and go to Dublin to learn the harp, myself and my sister, because he felt that at the time there was very little from the point of view of extracurriculars for children in the rural area. Again, he was coming from an urban area, from quite a wealthy school, and he was seeing a contrast there, but he wanted to provide the best for us, given the fact that he wouldn't have had the financial capability of the outlay, but yet he saw the need. So we had that wonderful opportunity, and then a music teacher did come to Tinahely, and the local Weir's shop, which it's turned now into a bed and breakfast, but that was the big store in Tinahely in the 60s, where we bought our Halloween masks, where we got our first musical instruments, which mine was a mandolin. And you could get your clothes mended in Weir's. You could buy your side of bacon. It was just your classic, general store in Tinahely that you could get everything in the days where there were no supermarkets and most people didn't have a car, so you had to buy everything in Tinahely. And obviously that has changed. So Samuel Weir's traded in Tinahely, I think, for about 3 generations. And the grandfather, Samuel, and then Harry and his brother Stanley carried on the business, and then eventually it was sold to another family who kept on the business. And then Mentons took it on for a while, and they turned it into a furnishing business. But that was the main source of my childhood, where we would get all the things we needed. So the childhood growing up, as I say, was a very safe one. I think we were given a lot of freedom, and it wasn't in any way neglectful. Today it probably would be considered neglect, but the big thing in our house was be home for your dinner at 5. So we were gone all day. We were up in the Dandy's Rock making our camp. We were down at the Footstick learning to swim or fish minnows. We would be down at the mill. Again, the level of the water was lower then, so we would be actually under the bridges. There are 3 bridges now over the River Derry, and I can still remember as a child sitting on those benches underneath the arches of the bridge that's still there today, fishing for minnows, paddling in the eelgrass, hanging out with our friends and just making camp, and living a kind of a Enid Blyton type existence. And I often, with my class, I often mention about Enid Blyton, because in a way she's showing the children today about childhood in a time where children didn't live in a goldfish bowl, where there were parents watching what they were doing every day. And often my class would say, was life much better for you when you were growing up? And I would say, we didn't have the luxuries that you have. We didn't have the access to information that you had. Certainly there were children in school that would not have got the attention that you guys get. There were children in school who suffered in the school because they were slapped. That doesn't happen anymore. So I always wanted it in my discussions with the children to try and present a very balanced. But I didn't want to say, we had it great, But certainly we had freedom that these children today don't have. And I suppose I would read Enid Blyton to them. I would encourage them to read, because that's a world where children had to make decisions about alerting the train driver to stop the train because there was this part of the track had fallen away, the story in the Railway Children. But they had to be proactive to see what was going on in their environment and know that there wasn't an adult that was going to sort it out for them. They had to be reliant themselves. So that's the childhood I had, and I've certainly benefited. And I'm not unique in that, because a lot of children grown up in that period of time, that was the way we had to learn. Another thing we did was in the centre of the village there's a market square. It was originally where the old original jail was, and you can see the bars underneath. But that market square has a great history attached to it. It's currently a library, and the rooms overhead are used for people they rented out. But that was originally a school. And it was the Church of Ireland school, because remember, Tinnahealy there was a huge presence. There was an Orange Lodge in Carnew, and if you look at the book of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, you will see that there was quite a majority of business people in the area were Church of Ireland. For instance, the Weir premises that I mentioned, they would have been, the Weir family was a Church of Ireland. The current Chambers that's still there since the 50s, Bertie Chambers was the owner. It's now owned by his grandson, Ben. He is continuing in the same business, again in general groceries, etc. You look at the current well, mainly the pubs today would actually are Church of Ireland as well, unusually. So there was a strong business presence, and the mainly owned by Church of Ireland traders. So the school in the centre of the town was for children, or the Church of Ireland children, not for the Catholic children. when you go up the steps of the market square, the top 3 rooms that are now rented out was the school for the Church of Ireland children, up to, I would say, up to the time, I would think probably the mid-60s, when they actually got their own school built out of Kilcommon, near the Kilcommon Church today. So, but my point of this story is that we used to have access to that area, and we had the freedom as a 10 and 11-year-old to put on little concerts up there in when it was the school had been vacated. And I remember very well putting on a concert for Trócaire, and at the time, and we would invite people in, and we set up our curtains, and we had some local grandparents would come, and we would charge them, and we learn off our little songs or our dances, and there was no adult telling us to do this. I befriended the Weir children, and to this day I'm so proud I am. They were the closest of friends. In fact, I celebrated Leonard's 70th birthday recently in a nice restaurant, and that's a friendship going back 70 years, and with their 2 siblings. So our closest friends, in a way, that we played with were Church of Ireland. So there was a real ecumenism here. It wasn't, we all got on, like it was, but we were very aware that they went to a different school to us. But we put on those concerts, and the money was sent off. And I remember our pictures appeared in the paper that we had raised this money ourselves, and we sent it to, I can't remember, was it Trócaire or Concern? I'm trying to think of the name. It was a different charity, but anyway, at the time. So the point is that we had that freedom to do that. There was no teacher telling us to do it, no parent. We did it ourselves. Now, it would have been facilitated because the Weir, Leonard Weir's mum was a teacher, so I suppose being a teacher she'd give those skills to her children as well. But we were encouraged to do that. We baked, we cooked. I remember going down to the Weir household, and we would bake, and we were given the kitchen to cook and bake and make cakes and make chocolate biscuit cake and all of that. And when Mrs. Weir was at work, and maybe we were at home, and maybe their dad was coming in from work, because he used to work in the fertiliser factory in Archaeological, which has since closed, and he'd come in for his, we'd have to maybe help with preparing his dinner. So we were given all those responsible jobs at 11 and 12. Then they eventually went to boarding school. I finished off my, I haven't actually spoken about my time here in the school. So again, that's my friendship area, that we had friends, but also my own school here in Tinneely National School. This was originally, was built in 1961, and it was called the New School at the time. My mother remembered well when they blessed the school, and the local Canon Darcy was here, and a little ceremony out at the front plaque, and I came along holding her hand, and she just remembered the principal, Mr. Hassett, had a little girl at the time, and when they lit the candle to bless the school, she thought it was a birthday candle, and went over, and to the hilarity of everybody around, she blew out the candle thinking it was a birthday candle. But I remember that little story she told me. But so we came to school here from the time I was 4. I was 4 in August, so I went to school in September, and I've no memory of anybody bringing me to school. I'm quite sure. Now, we had a lady called Sis Galvin minding us, because again, my mother came here for the 9 months, and she had no husband, so who minded us while she set up her business? She got Sis Galvin, who is alive today. She's in her late 80s. And Sis was a young girl of 18 who came, and in those days you could employ help to come into the house to help look after the children. So she had employed Sis to come in, mind us, while she set up her business. And when my dad came back, we managed to retain her for a number of years, even though, as I say, finances weren't great, but then again wages weren't great and labour was cheap at the time. So, but Sis has great memories of having her 21st birthday in our house and the cake that she had. And I've often chatted to her about the time. She loved working with my mum and dad, and I suppose they were a bit different. They weren't your typical Tinahely person, because they had come bringing their experiences from the outside in. So she enjoyed that. She used to cycle in every morning to help while my mum was, and then my dad was painting and doing all these other things. So we came to school. I have no memory of being brought to school, but I'm quite sure I must have been brought. I then once my older sister actually would have brought me. There's 2 years between my sister and myself. She's her name is Orla, and she probably would then, if my mother brought me initially, then Orla would have brought me. So we walked to school, and it's nearly a kilometre really from the village where I live, up every morning, and we would go home for lunch at 12:30. And a lot of the children stayed in school because they weren't lucky enough to be living in the village. They either walked in from outside and some children were bussed in, but basically they would come with their lunch in school. And I do remember the teacher, and I'm looking here at the fireplace that's boarded up now, allowing them to put their little bottles of milk in front so that the milk would be warm, but all the bottles would have a plug of paper in the top because there were no corks so that they wouldn't spill, and their lunches were wrapped in newspaper. And I remember thinking, how that was hard for those kids. I could go home to a hot dinner, and we would run down the hill home, and the dinner would be on the table for us, and then we would run back. It was the era of cowboys and Indians, so we used to slap ourselves on the side, giddy up horsey to get us up the hill fairly fast, because it's a fair old trek of a run up, but we did that every day. We'd be back here for 1 o'clock. But as we were approaching the school, if we saw the rooks and the crows descending on the playground, we knew we were going to be in trouble because we were late. That meant that all the other children who'd had their lunch in the yard and maybe had left crumbs, the crows had come down to feed on the scraps, and the children were inside, and we might get into trouble for being late. I was lucky. My parents were really friendly with the principal, and I say that in a sense of pity for other children, because I don't think that was the case for other children. And I don't want to go into it in depth, because I do know that in the era of corporal punishment, we were lucky, because my mother was a Clare woman and the principal here was a Clare man. So he didn't in any way harm us, okay? But it was the culture of the time. The children were beaten, and they were all around me. And to this day, and I'm 68 in August, I think, why didn't I stand up for the child next to me, my school pal, who was having her hair lifted from up underneath her, up above her earlobe, because she hadn't done her homework. And of course I understand, as a child you don't have that confidence, and you don't see, and it was unfair and unjust. I do remember parents of the children who were beaten coming to the door, and I'm looking at the very same door. I didn't know that parent was absolutely irate, and there might be fisticuffs with the teacher, with the principal outside in the corridor. I have to say, it happened. I can't deny it. I watched it. I witnessed it. And I know that when we had the 100-year celebration of this school, as a teacher, we put a huge effort into putting together a nice little booklet in memory. And we remember the teachers. And I was taught by quite a brilliant teacher, but he was a victim himself of the system at the time, where it was payment by results. So if your students weren't doing well, you mightn't get the salary that you should have got, because the results weren't good. So that was the cruel system that was imposed on teachers. Also, maybe there would be 40 children, 50 children in the room, no help with learning support, forget it. If you were considered bright, you might be scholarship material, and you were allowed to stay on to do maybe a 7th class so that you would get extra tuition. He was a good teacher, but again, he had his own issues, and definitely the children were harmed. And so, how can you balance it? It was wrong, it shouldn't have happened. But again, you can't just judge it in isolation. I will be very balanced in my judgment of the whole thing. But in today's terms, the children should have come first, and we can't judge the past with the norms of today. We have to accept it wasn't right, but we have to accept that was very much the culture of the day. So it wasn't some of the classrooms weren't happy memories, but when we attempted to have this 100 years celebration, and we were going back now from, say, 2011 to, 1921, I think that was it. Yeah, that was the past. No, 1911 to 2011, that was it. And we did a fair bit of research. We went into the census at the time, and we recorded the various different principals that were in the school, and we noted their grave headstones in the local cemetery. We involved the children in doing grave rubbings, to let them see, the importance of their local cemetery, how as a repository of the history of the people in the area. But we were struck. We organised lovely celebrations. We opened up the roll books. We had photocopies of the relevant eras, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, of the entry in the roll book, because these roll books were the repository of so much information in a school. And we put them up on the walls and display so that people would come and look and say, oh, there's my name on that roll book, and they're the days I was in and marked present, etc. And so was my friend in school. The fascination for so many people. We had an open evening here. We had a wonderful celebration. We had talks. We brought in speakers. We produced the book. We did a video of the whole thing. The children created a song. The school was built in 1961, and that's a song that's on YouTube. I don't know how many thousands of likes it's had. It was recorded we brought in some very wonderful musicians, Ken Davis and his friend Cindy, and they recorded the song by way of commemoration. But to get back, I've gone around the world to explain, there were so many past pupils that would not put their foot across the threshold, or we had to do a lot of encouragement to get them to come to that open evening. And that was sad for me, because I suppose I was so aware that this was a happy place, and it has been a happy place in all my time here. I came here as a young teacher in 1979 in September, and the principal that taught me actually had sadly contracted cancer. So I was here for he actually employed me here. So I was coming back to the school that I had learned, and I had got my primary education in, to become now as a young teacher. And I had a passion. I loved teaching, and that's always what I wanted to do. But I went around it a kind of a circuitous route. I went in to do secondary teaching, and I did my HDIP, and then I realised, no, my real wish was to do primary. So I went and did my further postgrad, and I became a primary teacher. Again, there were 2 jobs on offer in those days. That were, you were offered. So I was offered a job in Ballythomas, which is the other end of the parish, or a job in Tinnahealy. And my thoughts were, well, it can get very snowy out in the Gap, and I might have difficulty getting out there every morning. So I opted to come to my local school, and I've been here ever since. So you could say I have been slightly institutionalised, to say the least, because I came here as a 5-year-old, and I'm still here as a 68-year-old. I'm proud to say that I came here as a 4-year-old. So it's a long legacy. It's a very happy one. And I suppose my big thing when I came here was I wanted to do something to make this school a happier place. So that's that had a rocky start too, because we've followed on with again not a very successful situation it was a tricky one, because I probably don't want to go into it too much, but all I can just say is that principal was here for 20 years, but he was eventually suspended by the Department of Education. So prior to this new building being built and opened, and I spoke about the blessing and all of that, the school prior to that was in the next door area, and it's currently now turned into a beautiful community hall. But the school that I actually started in for a few months before this was built was in this it was a former fever hospital, and it was used for to treat the epidemic of TB, which was rampant in Ireland in the 20s, 30s and 40s. And Dr. Noel Brown was instrumental in bringing in an immunisation programme which has helped to eradicate it. He bears huge responsibility for his actions in that area. But the school was, when it ceased being a fever hospital, and I don't have the dates on it, probably it was no longer used. Anyway, I know that school was actually used as a school. So for the purpose of teaching the children history, we call that the old school, and this is the new school. And from probably about the 20s upwards, that's where the children were taught in the area. And again, unfortunately, there was an issue of a very brilliant principal, but had issues. And so you're talking here of of several generations of teaching, which certainly must have contributed to the low level of attainment in the area academically. That has changed, and as I say, now with modern education and the training of teachers is so much better, and school has changed hugely. We have the standards have gone up, but I think when we did look into the stats for literacy in Wicklow, Tinahely would have been a low performance in from the time records were kept. So I would hope that, obviously all schools the standards have gone up, and there's a much greater happiness in school and a greater professionalism in the job. And thankfully those bad old days aren't around with us anymore. But I suppose I have the breadth of my vision and time in the area to have seen that whole trajectory change. So I stayed here, and as I said, my big thing was to make it a happy place, and we have it. I'm so proud that we've done that. It's been a wonderful experience for me. I never ever regret any day coming into school. I think my big problem was, how will they get rid of me? That would be the problem. Things that I suppose I would have done in the school, I try to give children an understanding of their locality, because as we know, it takes a village to grow a child, and it's so important for children to feel that they know where they came from. So that's getting to know the fields, getting to know the walks, getting to know their local area, their church, the graveyard, and their river. And that's why I've been really thrilled and delighted with the CUPHAT project, because to bring those children down to the river that I literally grew up alongside, and to look at the biodiversity of our river and teach the children how to check to see if they had if there was pollution in the river or otherwise, if it was clean, and to teach it in a very simple, fun way, like the nasties, the baddies and the goodies, and seeing the fish life. It just was a wonderful project for me to be part of, and I was just so thankful to UCD for investing the money and investing the really talented staff to come down, to deal with the children, to deal in such a nice way with the children, and it was really a joy for me to be part of. And again, it was another part of their local, getting to know the local environment. So I really was thankful for that. Again, what would we do in the school? I suppose I'm now training the next generation of teachers, and I want them, even though they may not live in the area like I do, to bring as much knowledge to these young teachers so that they can pass it on. It's probably a faint wish. I try my best, so that they will know the history of the church, the history of the recent history of the very old pre-famine graveyard, which has just recently been finished by Yvonne Whitty, the local archaeologist, and she has just done a full research on the Whitefield graveyard, which was the pre-famine graveyard predating the current Killavany graveyard, which was probably put in around the mid-1800s when the church was built. In fact, the church was built, I think, in 1843, I think. So there's a plaque in the church that will actually give all those full details. So prior to that, it was the church down in Whitefield. The graveyard was there. I think prior to that it was the Kilcommon, where the Kilcommon church, because it was, I think, decommissioned as a Catholic church and it was turned into a Protestant church. I think that's the case. So, but the local burial site was at Whitefield. So it's lovely to see that Whitefield graveyard now has been researched. The gates into it have been upgraded, and in the old original gates. And the graves, there's a general template of the cruciform church laid out, and you can check it out on Yvonne Whitty's site because it's available. Extensive work by the local TUS and FOSS workers have upgraded it, and I know Father Gann, our local PP, has held mass down there in the summertime. A graveyard mass. So again, I think that was suspended for COVID, but I think the plan is to go back to doing that. But it's a joy to go down there and look at the bluebells and the primroses, just completely carpeting the original sacred burial ground of the ancestors of the people living in Tinnahealy. So I want the young teachers in this to understand that, to know it. And again, I suppose when I do retire, I would love to come back and keep upskilling the younger teachers here, because they need to know the area that they teach in so that they can pass on this information to the children in their care. So that would be very much close to my heart. The other thing is, I suppose the area here has developed huge interest in walks. And the Tomnafinnog walk has been developed in 2007, I think, and that has been extended out to the railway. Again, as part of the outdoor education programme that would be in the school, we would take the children out there more than once a year. In fact, they do nature walks down there because, again, they can walk from the school, but using the local environment to enhance the learning in the school. So they can look at the river, they can look at the biodiversity, they can plot and log the wildflowers en route. But every year we have a massive, and it's actually happening next week, the whole school leaves the school here and they walk to Tomnafinnog, and it's a good long 4k walk. Okay, juniors, seniors, they all walk. And when we arrive, they do little stretches and they have a drink, and then they have a run. And they run, the little ones run to the barrier and they get a stamp. And that's a good, maybe a good kilometre in speed. And they get their stamp and they run back across the bridge and they have their drink. The older ones do the cross country and they come back and they have their drink. And then we have our lunch by the river, and then everybody gets into their shorts and t-shirts, and they all get into the river. And the whole thing is that they, again, to experience the river as I did as a child, to get in, and we have the no splash zone and the splash zone, and it's a wonderful kind of catharsis at the end of the year. We're all in the water splashing, and it's a lovely thing to wind up the year with. And they make their own boats from recyclable materials, and they sail the boats down the river, and there's always not a prize, there's just who comes first. So you have children at the senior end of the school at the end of the race, and then you have the teachers at the top, depending on the age level, and they let off the boats, and the responsibility of the senior class is to catch the boats and see who comes in first. And of course it's the honour and glory of who comes first, and so that's a joy. They make the boats from recyclable materials, bring them in on the morning, and then they sail, and the excitement of that is just, I can't describe it to you, it's wonderful. The parents take the boats out first in the morning so the children don't have to carry them, so with great support from the parents to help us out on all of that. So that's again another outdoor activity that the children love. In autumn they go down there and they do their autumn walks, and Sammy the squirrel is hidden in the tree and they have to try and find him. At Christmas time we would have a Santa dash down there, and again there's a great commitment to fitness in the school. So every morning when the children come in, they put down their bags, and we have a 500 metre track around the school, and they run. And again, so you'd probably wonder why they can manage the Tom na Fiannog, but it's just par for the course. They love that running, they do it every morning, and they're a very fit bunch of children. So again, that would be the thing that I would have had an athletics club here for years, about 14, 15 years, and I just saw the importance of running. It's since been disbanded, but it was a big interest of mine at the time to encourage the children to run, and we had a lot of local children competing in
would there have been that when you were young yourself? Would that have... No, there was nothing like that. I suppose football would have been the big thing when I was in school, but the girls did sewing, so the boys went off and played football and the girls did sewing classes. We wouldn't really have been introduced to athletics. That was something that my son had particular interest in. I was teaching him in school, and we got it going when he was even quite young, and we kept it up for about 15 years, and it was a lot of help locally to get it off the ground. And I had a sergeant from the Irish Army who lived locally. He would come and help out with the training, and with different people, the local talent that would come in. That's the other thing about living in a small community like Tinnahealy. Tinnahealy always attracted the artistic type of person. I mean, we've Vincent Brown living here, who is a renowned sculptor. We had David Hanley, who is the author of several books. He was a broadcaster in RT. He settled here and lived and wrote several of his books down here. Today we have Sebastian Barry living not too far away from here. We had so when my dad came, there was a sense that Tinnahealy seemed to attract the outsider. You had Colin Brennan, a silversmith. You had, it seemed to attract people that were of the artistic bent. Again, we're an hour and a half from Dublin, so not too far, but yet far enough away. And yet, so there was, it always seemed to attract that type. And to this day, we have our local arts centre in the courthouse, and that has been there. My husband has been the chair for about 30 years, and they have secured grant aid funding from the Arts Council to again enrich the cultural life of the area. My husband retired recently from that post, and it's taken over by a new group, and it's hopefully they will continue to access the grants to bring in you've top class musicians coming from Dublin who might be playing the Dublin circuit. They're coming to Tinnahealy to play at a cheaper rate. So we've been blessed to have lived here. I've reared my 4 children here,
and had that cultural experience for them to go to films, to get involved in the drama club that was there with Maggie Gallagher. Tramps and Poets was the name of her drama group for years. High class drama put on by children. The art that was there, the art lessons. It's just, we're blessed to have had it, and please God, it will continue. So, as I say, Tinnahealy's always benefited from bringing the outsider in, because what they're doing is they're bringing their skill set into a community. They're coming in, and they're no longer, they're now big fish, I suppose, in a small pool. Whereas if they came from, like my father came from Dublin, you mightn't have the chance to share your skills in a bigger area. Whereas coming into a smaller area, people will look, will you go on this committee? Will you do this? And suddenly you have, a variety drama group for the adults set up, because Bree Green moved into the area 30 years ago and bought a cottage and added so much to the cultural life of Tinnahealy. And Pat Dixon, he again came from Dunleary. Sally Noggin came down, settled here with his family. He brings his skills into the area. Just Tinnahealy has absolutely benefited down through the years. I know David Hanley, I mentioned David Hanley. He was involved in fundraising to develop what, as I said to you, was the Fever Hospital. That burnt down in the early 70s, and it was just a derelict site. They actually fundraised, David Hanley and the committee fundraised to make that to develop a community centre, and it was an inter-church, so that on the committee. And
when would that have been? That
would have been, David was in Tinnahealy in the 70s. Carmel and David, we knew them well, they reared their children here. Russell and his daughter, I've forgotten her name, they reared their children here, and he was involved in it, So he wrote his book here, and he had kind of pulled away from Bord Fáilte at the time, the tourism board, and had been working for RT, and then just took time out to come to Tinnahealy. So that draw of people from the outside, they brought their talents and their expertise. And in fairness to the local people, they were embraced, I remember talking to a chap, Tony Hickey, a wonderful actor. Wow, what an actor. God rest him, he died only a number of years ago. And I remember one day he mentioned my husband Frank. He said, I remember when your family came to Tinnahealy. And he said, I remember walking up the street and having a little look in the window, and I would see things that I would never see in other homes, like paintings on the wall that I would never see. Now, your dad was a painter, but he said somehow in my childish perception, I knew you were different. You weren't, cousins of the Burns down the road. You were a family that came into an area, and you weren't connected, and you were different. And I was fascinated by that. I remember thinking, as a child, I remember him telling me that story. I wasn't in any way aware that we were different. My father had a long grey beard. He wore a cape. He had a sense of style about him, even though we didn't have the money or the bank account to back it up. I suppose he came with, a sense of bringing in his experiences from another world, and his many worlds that he'd been in the war and living in Dunleary, etc. So he loved Tinnahealy, and I remember him saying, the story my mother has, when she picked him up, I think, in Dublin off the mail boat at the time, because he'd obviously travelled, and then they got the train to Rathdrum. And my mother's name was Mick, because she was one of 6 girls, and her father and mother never managed to have a boy, so my mother was called Mick. So she remembers my father saying, as they were coming in on the train to Rathdrum, Mick, is Tinnahealy the size of Rathdrum? And she sort of was so ecstatic about recommending Tinnahealy. She said, oh, Dennis, much, much bigger. But of course, the reverse was the case. So when my father then, they obviously got some hackney driver to drive them from Rathdrum to Tinnahealy, and he walked up the main street and up Barton Street where we were living to this home that my mother had created unbeknownst to him. Well, she was obviously telling him in letters, but it was a whole world that she had created with her 3 children and a business for him to walk back into. And his first comment was, "Mick, when does the next stagecoach pull out?" You know, in other words, it was like moving into the Wild West, and it was the valley of the squinting windows, because people wanted to know who were these people that had just moved into Barton Street, and they weren't connected to anybody locally. And there was a fascination, I suppose, because we were from the outside. Thankfully nowadays that's changed. We're a very, very diverse community. You have people coming from all walks of life and all creeds, and they're welcomed in locally. We have Polish people. I know up to about 6-7 years ago, 10% of our enrolment in the school was Polish, Latvian. That's changed now. That has reduced hugely. And many of the Polish population have actually either gone back to Poland or moved on with their children. They're not in the school as such. We have a small cohort now, possibly about 10, either Polish, Latvian, and we have 4 Syrian children. So again, a lovely diverse community that these children are growing up in, and that's such a wonderful experience for them to see other cultures in such a small area like this, you know. So I suppose looking back on it, and I reflect, I just feel that I've been very privileged to grow up here. My children have been very privileged to grow up here. And I know the children that are in the school are happy. They are. I mean, you obviously have children who have issues, but I do know that they are safe and secure in this school, and I'm very happy about that. That is a safe environment for them to come to, and we've lovely parents. And I'm also struck by most of the parents that have sent their children to school are all past pupils of mine. So that's a real joy for me to see these parents now bringing back their children and having a confidence in this school to give that this school that they went to will have a good experience and a good education that they will get. So that is really rewarding for me, and my husband often calls me a pedagogical grandmother. So and that is true, but I'm proud to be able to say that.
Is that a common thing? So obviously you left Tinnahealy. You would have studied, was it in Blackrock?
I studied in UCD.
UCD, yeah.
And got my degree there. And then I went on to do the postgrad in as a higher diploma in education to become a secondary school teacher. But my big thing, this is the other thing for me, and I mean, this influence from outside. Again, you're growing up as a child in a small rural area, and the efforts that my father had to go to get us to learn a musical instrument. When I went to secondary school, which was Carnew, the local Carnew, it was the technological school at the time, I had the privilege of learning Spanish. And again, I was so excited by the opportunity. I don't know what it was about it, that I was learning about another world. I can vividly remember this. We loved our Spanish teacher, and we loved learning Spanish. And then when I went on, I could only do what they called the group cert and the inter-cert at the time. You did your group cert after second year. And that was very much a vocational training. You learned to knit, to sew, to cook, to scrub tables, how to clean a toilet. They were all, the subject was husbandry or housewifery. And that was for my group, for the group cert. So we learned all these life skills. And I mean, that is certainly not a PC word to use today, housewifery. But that was the topic, that was the subject that we learned in school for the group cert. We couldn't do the leaving cert in Carnew because they only went up as far as June. So we were bused to Tullow, over to Carlow, every morning from Tinahely to do our Leaving Cert. But the wonderful principal that we had in Carnew, Mr. O'Shea, God rest him, he arranged for a Spanish teacher to travel over to us to Tullow so that we could continue to Leaving Cert to learn our Spanish. Now, why am I telling this long story? Because Spanish has been a passion. I studied Spanish when I went to UCD. I loved it, and every summer I went abroad and I taught English in Spain and I looked after the Domecq family children when I had done my Leaving Cert. They're a famous Sherry family down the south of Spain, and I looked after their children. They were very much titled family, but I learned my Spanish with those 3-year-old and 2-year-old and a 1-year-old because I was with them all day, and I learned a lot. So my love of Spanish absolutely came from learning it here, and it was again this realisation that there's another world out there, and I'm really fascinated by it and loving to get that opportunity. So again, it was, that led on to my, as I say, education. But so what did I do then after I had done my HDip? I got a job in St Andrews. It's a private school for a secondary school in Dublin. A lot of the children I had to deal with were children of diplomats. So you might have the Argentinian diplomat to Dublin, whatever, in staying in Dublin. His children would go to St Andrews. So if they wanted to keep up their Spanish, I was employed as a Spanish teacher. So I'd be preparing children for Inter-Cert at the time, Junior Cert today, and the Leaving Cert in Spanish. And that was my topic, my subject. So I did that for 1 year, but as I got through it, the principal of the school was Professor Duke. I asked him, look, I really love what I'm doing, but I would love to go back to doing primary. So he gave me a very good reference to apply to get in to do my postgrad. So I got in to do the postgrad in St Pat's, and I suppose the rest is history. I had the qualification to work in a primary school. And then my husband, who was a very keen jazz musician and blues historian, living in Dublin at the time, I met him in Trinity at a Christy Moore gig, I remember. He was introduced to me by a very good mutual friend, Jimmy Joyce, who was studying music in Trinity with Frank. And we met there, and a bit like my mother, I lured Frank back to Tinahely. My mother lured my father from Melbourne to Tinahely, but I lured him down because, again, he was the editor of the Grapevine magazine in Dublin. He had his own little side security business, and he'd done his degree in Trinity, but he was an avid reader and but hadn't really decided on a career. Had actually done his HDip and could have taught English and history in secondary school. But from looking over my shoulder, watching what I was doing, he thought, my God, I might try that out. So I qualified, he qualified a year later and did his postgrad in Drumcondra in St Pat's. And I came down here and taught from 79. And then the following year he came to Avoca and was a classroom mainstream teacher there for maybe 18 years. And then he transferred into learning support because it was a real passion of his, and he went and did the masters in it to upskill. So it was an area he really wanted to develop into. So when I took over as principal here 20 years ago, I was a mainstream teacher up to then I took over as principal. Again, I lured him back to work with me because I felt my learning support teacher at the time had just retired, and I thought, I do need somebody in here. So I got him in, and I had him here. He worked here for me, and we set up a very good model of learning support in the school, and we worked very harmoniously together. And you'd imagine, husband and wife in a small area, that would not work so well, but he always was on the other staff's side rather than my side. We played that little game because it was very important not to have any kind of sense of it was going to be myself and my husband on one side and the other staff on the other. He very much was in the camp of the other teachers, and if there was a complaint about the level of heating, it went to me, and whatever. And he was very much, and that was important because it would upset the balance in a small school if you had the principal and the husband on one side. So we were very conscious of that. But very happy times, and he retired about 4 years ago. I miss his professionalism because he was top class at what he did. And he actually lectured in the Frebel College for a number of years. He lectured teachers when they were doing their diploma in learning support. So that was he in other words, he knows his stuff, and because he loved it, very passionate about it. So anyway, that's another phase that's over. He's always there to help me and help the new people in the business of learning support to help the transition, because he's always shared his expertise, and he's been wonderful in that way, So I suppose the school that we have here now, another big interest would be the garden. I'm passionate about gardening, and I would have encouraged the children to get involved in a garden from my early days as principal here, and even prior to it we had a little garden where we had our apple trees and our, but we ended up building on, about 5 years ago, we built on 2 classrooms for children with special needs. So that actually took away our garden, which is literally outside the window there. That was our garden. Along there was a sloped garden, so we've actually built on now a soft play area for the junior infants to play on. So we had to develop then and move further down to develop a new garden, and parents came in and built raised beds for us, and we got a tunnel put in, and that's been going on for the last, I suppose, about 15 years. But my very good friend who would have come to this school, Kathleen Hart, she is a trained horticulturist, in fact used to work in Kew Gardens. She actually used to grow the roses for the Queen, and she worked there, did all her training in England, and worked for many years there, and eventually came back to Ireland. And again, the small community drawing you back to your roots, she set up a nursery here with her husband, and that ran for many years. She converted an old Fitzwilliam cottage, very beautifully restored, and then put in a top class nursery called Old Cottage Nursery, and supplied all the local people with really top quality plants for many years. The business then went downhill, and she decided to close it. And so I thought, here's an opportunity now to me to get Kathleen into the school, because so for many years she volunteered, coming in, teaching the children proper plant husbandry, how to weed, how to dig, how to identify, how to grow your own food. And I would work with her, and all the teachers would work, again upskilling the teachers. So she's with me to this day. She's in every Friday now. And because I'm no longer a class teacher, I coordinate all the different class levels and teachers, that they have a stint with Kathleen on a Friday, we say one class, and then she tells them what needs to be done the following week in the garden. So then there's a group of 4 on each day in that class. They've been told what to do, and they have to carry out those tasks. There's a little list, we keep a diary, they know what they have to do for the week ahead, and it might involve watering, planting, whatever. But again, so I'm so delighted that these children are getting, again, another wonderful life skill, that they're learning about growing their own food, and how to maintain it, and how to re-nourish the soil, and to create their own soil from leaf mould that we collect and put into bags, or from our fruit scraps that we have in our composter. So they're learning it from a really good person. She's top class. Recently, one of our teachers has taken on a B post, an AP2 post in the school, which is outdoor education, and she's now going to carry on the mantle, and I'm so happy about that. I think that's so important, because I'm preparing now for my transition, and I mean in 2 years' time, God willing, and I stay healthy, I will have two more years in the school. So my mission now is to transition and to upskill and to bring forward the school that I have been involved in for so long, and to, you know, encourage the new staff to carry on the really good things about the school. And there are so many good things about the school. These are the extra things that the children benefit from, and it enriches their primary school education to such a level, you know. So again, local help. I have Jonathan Colston, a top class gardener. He's just planted a wildflower garden with the children, you know, and he would work alongside with Kathleen. His wife was my secretary for 18 years. Adrian ran the Use It office in Dublin for 30 years. And again, that's another example of people coming in from the outside into the community, bringing their skills, volunteering. Jonathan, to this day, the man is in his early 70s. He comes in and rotivates that garden, showing the children how to rotivate, how to dig out the weeds, how to level it, to stamp it with their feet. It's all on record. We photograph the children, we photograph all of that. Adrian, as I say, retired 3 years ago and she was my secretary for all those years, gave so much to the school. But here's my mother again. She met Jonathan and Adrian before I met them, because when they came to Tinnahealy, maybe 18 years ago, they were renovating an old house, Jimmy Hunt's old house, just up the road from Barton Street. And my mother used to walk by on her walks, and she used to say, my God, they're doing such hard work there, the two of them. And, you know, they'd be coming out with barrows of, you know, stone or whatever. And she used to bring them up some jam from her garden. She'd grow her own stuff in her own garden, and maybe some little treat that she'd made, and she befriended them. And one day, Adrian said, she obviously knew my mother had said that I was involved in the school and whatever. If she ever needs any help, just let us know. We would love to help her out. And literally that summer, my previous secretary, who'd been with me for about 12 years, decided to go back into education, and she was retiring and leaving us, not retiring, but leaving us, going on to further education. And that summer I said, what am I going to do? Marie Grove was leaving. And Adrian stepped in. I mean, she ran the Use It office in Dublin, and she's now coming down to a rural school, paid very little money because the Department of Education didn't believe at the time in paying secretaries to run schools. She came and worked for me for 18 years. Now, we absolutely made sure that she was earning the best we could afford with the budget, which would have been probably double of what the department were recommending, because again, they didn't value school secretaries. But I knew her worth, and I knew what she could do, and I was just so thrilled, because at that time, for all of those years, I was a teaching principal. Only in the last 4 years I have become an administrative principal. So I don't teach anymore, except I pop in and out, and I can do little lessons with the children, but I don't have responsibility for a class. I'm basically managing now a staff of 15. When I was a class teacher, staff was much more reduced. We didn't have the special classes, we didn't have the extra resources in the school. So the staff has absolutely exploded, and I've been granted an admin principalship, a real bonus, by the way, for this stage in my career, because I think if I were still teaching, I think that either the children would have got tired of me, because, you know, you do get tired. I mean, teaching is a profession you throw your whole self into if you're really fond of it, and it gets tiring, you know what I mean, especially when you're trying to run a school as well as be responsible for 26 children every day. So I wouldn't have managed the two. I wouldn't have continued as long if I had to manage the two. So this came to me as an absolute bonus, and I thought, I'll never manage in the office. I never want to stay in the office all day, but actually it has turned out I've loved it. And I've an opportunity now to see the whole school and have time for teachers. I can go into the special classes, I can go into the mainstreams, and I can mentor new teachers, and I have a much greater breadth of responsibility, and I have time for it. So I'm really privileged about that. That's really been a great bonus for me, you know. So Jonathan and Adrian, another example of people coming from outside, giving their skills. I have the crochet ladies coming in here on a Friday to again bring in their skills. Lucy Moller, wonderful lady's taken on the tidy towns locally. She's only arrived in the area in the last few years. She was top designer with River Island, living in London. Very high-powered career, working for 16 years. Got tired of it all, came back, and is now living locally, doing classes on upcycling clothing, teaching people locally. She does alterations, and she's thrown herself hugely into Tinnahealy tidy towns and contributing so much. Encourage the children. Put us forward for Gardener of the Year, which unknown to us, we won last year. She's now put us in for another Super Value Award, and knowing what we do, and just been so supportive. And she just rang me 3 weeks ago to say, listen, RTE want to do a programme on upcycling. Would you mind if I went in with the 5th and 6th senior classes to do it? And I said, but of course not, I would love it. So she came in with a team of directors, film directors, all that on a Friday evening. She set up the class completely raw. She had all her equipment ready, and she was teaching the children how to upcycle last year's jeans into this year's very snazzy shorts. And she had all her equipment, wonderful little film. It'll go out on air in January. These people coming into us more. There's been countless films. This premises was used for filmmaking. Again, I'd be very open to all of that, you know, bringing in people in and using the facility we have. The facility is used every week also with the AA. They have a quiet premises here going back 40 years, and I would never disturb it, never have anything on, so that they can provide a facility locally for people. So again, the school is very much part of the community, and I'm proud to say, and I'd hope that will continue in my absence, you know.
You mentioned a few times there, Shifra, actually the old Fitzwilliam cottages, and even your father and the portrait of Lady Fitzwilliam. You were alive during the last years of the Fitzwilliam estate. What memories do you have, or what knowledge do you have of those final years?
Yeah. To be honest with you, I wouldn't have a lot, because if you remember, we didn't have a car, so we wouldn't have travelled over there. But we were very, very aware that Lady Fitzwilliam, in her declining years, was running the estate, and it just became, you know, financially non-viable for them to continue. But I just do know that Fitzwilliam as a landlord was considered a very benign landlord. When you think of landlords in Ireland, he was considered a benign landlord. For instance, the current siting of the siting of the Catholic Church is on land donated by Lord Fitzwilliam, which is out of the town. Now, people would say, why did he give us land outside the town? We all had to walk to the church. But it's in a wonderful, beautiful setting up in a hill overlooking the town. It's unusual to have a church so far outside the town. But he was considered a benign landlord. He provided a lot of work, and I do know that the butler, he's one of the butlers on the estate, by the name of, his name was now? Tommy, I just can't think of it. I'll think of it in a second. He would have great memories of working on the estate. The person who would be the main repository of information about the estate would be Kevin Lee. He's the man who really would have all the information, the historical records there, and they've done a lot of work in the restoration of the old house. And fairly recently, the golf club have bought a portion of it. So, but my memories as a child, no, I don't really have much memory of her, except that she was in her declining years, and you know, the estate was in trouble. It wasn't a vibrant estate giving huge employment locally. and I mean, in its day, like, I mean, you had, huge numbers employed in the gardens, in the tree husbandry, managing the trees. There were a lot of tradespeople who actually learned to trade. Again, the horses had to be shod, all of that. So they would have, employed a lot of people locally. And of course, they're responsible for building mainly all the houses. When you go into Shillelagh, all those Fitzwilliam cottages, they're all Fitzwilliam estate cottages, as are the ones on Kevin Street. They have that distinctive stone frontage and built into a very solid standard. So they definitely left their mark. But it's nice to know that they were benign. They were not considered, there are towns in Ireland where the local landlord was hated. That's not the case. And I do know that in the history that we did in the school, we looked into the archive, the newspaper archive, and there was a mention in the 30s of the children in this school presenting what they called a loving cup to the birth of one of the Fitzwilliam children, or grandchildren at the time, maybe it was, as a little gift, and it was an inscribed gift from the children of Tinnahealy. So, and that appeared in the Wicklow People in the notes, and we noted that in our little history of the school. So again, that's a little anecdote of to support the view that they were considered benign. They weren't. They were good landlords. They provided employment, and they managed the estate very, very well.
You also spoke about your husband. Obviously, was a musician and and had a knowledge of jazz. When you came back to Tinnahealy to start working here and move back here, what was the social life like in the sort of the late 1970s? Particularly for sort of a young, newly qualified teacher?
Very good question, because my husband was shell-shocked, to be honest with you. Here he had left, a capital city, living on the north side, having, edited the Grapevine magazine, having, a very interesting social life by way of playing music. Don Baker, Johnny Norris, Red Peters, these were all the people who he played with around Dublin. Slattery's Blues Club, Mary Street, there was a pub there that we used to play in as well. So he left all of that to come to Tinnahealy, and I do know he suffered in the first few years. And it was, you see, nowadays, when you look at life now with the internet, living in the most isolated part of Ireland, you could be connected to the world. And that is, the huge benefit of the internet. But in those days, we didn't have that. So we set about, obviously, having a family and building our own home. So that took up a huge amount of his time, and he learned a lot of skills from his dad, because his dad was very, very wonderful with his hands, so he taught him anything he knows with regard to. So we would have taken on local builders and built by what they called direct labour at the time. You got a mortgage from the bank and you built your house, but it was they wouldn't give you the money until the job was finished. So you had to borrow, and it was a really crazy way of borrowing, but it was the only thing open to us at the time. So he threw himself into that, yes. But his big thing was he got a monthly subscription to the New York Review of Books. That was his lifeline, to be honest with you, because that was his stimulation. He needed that. An avid reader, and of course, absolutely built bookshelves and, read so much with the children, etc. And I suppose family life, in a way, took over. But I do know in those first 2 years before we had started a family, it really did rock him, where have I ended up here, And I suppose I was coming back to family, so I probably wasn't too aware of it. He'd say it to me, but again, resilient, he just tried to get on with it and try and make life as stimulating as he could. He would have known David Hanley. Because again, he was very much embraced into my family, and my father was very fond of him, and they would have lovely discussions. They played chess together, so there would have been stuff like that we would have. But as regards young people, his own age group, no, not really. But we did decide, right, we're going to set up our own band. So we had what they called the Jitterbug Jug Band. I played the tea-chest bass for my sins, and my friend Jimmy Joyce, who introduced me to Frank, Jimmy played guitar, and Yvette played the washboard with the thimbles, and Frank sang and played the guitar. And Jitterbug Jug Band would have been the skiffle bands, basically back when people didn't have an instrument, they had to create their own instruments in the blues in America. So we had a gig locally in Tyrrell's pub, which is now called Seavers, and we also played in Carlow, and we played, we used to go up and down to Dublin occasionally, and then the children arrived. I remember well, my second child, Dara, who's now 36, I was feeding him myself, and he was only a couple of months old, and we brought him, you think of it, in the back of a Fiat 127 with the double bass that we had bought from Bill Whelan across the top of the seating. He was in a basket underneath, I was in the back seat, and my sister came along with me, and we drove with all the other instruments to Dublin to play in a blues club there. And halfway through the thing, my sister would be outside looking after Dara. He needs an interview, he needs to be fed. So I come off stage and feed my young man, only 2 or 3 months. But you did all those things because you were young and it just didn't bother. But I mean, today, like bringing a child in a car without a seatbelt, having a double bass across the child, you wouldn't do it, but you did these things because you had to do it. So, in short, my husband, extremely happy that he settled here. He got very involved, as I said, chairman of the courthouse for 30 years, very involved in that way, and that was a huge outlet for him because the arts was really big for him, having been involved in the Great Fine Arts Centre. So he would have brought down a lot of musicians. Don Baker has played here umpteen times. He would have brought a lot of classical musicians through Music Network, and there would have been a really good, exciting programme from the arts point of view in Tinahely for those years. So it was a huge contribution he gave locally, and that definitely helped. But you have the need to replace what you had, and then you bring it into your community by taking part and getting involved. And again, it's the big fish in the small pool syndrome, and for anybody who I've seen has come into the area, they've brought nothing but their skills and their talents. And it's not to be in any way condescending about the local people. They've worked with the local people who know the area, and they have been embraced by the local people. This is the interesting thing, to be part of the committees, because they too saw that these people were bringing in a talent. It wasn't a question of they're taking over. They brought their skills and started and brought along the local people as well. So I could see that, was a huge outlet for Frank in that sense,
I'd say that would be fairly uncommon in the sort of in the milieu, the environment you describe would be fairly uncommon in Irish rural towns. This kind of this sort of vibrant art scene, the courthouse being one of sort of a bit of a trailblazer in that respect, and you mentioned artists, people coming to this place.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
It's a question I've not found an answer to. It's something about Tinahely. Tinahely, it's a beautiful location. I mean, just the beauty of the village is lovely. It seemed it was that distance from Dublin, so it wasn't the west of Ireland. So you had people wanting to move out of city prices and housing, etc., and maybe a more sustainable lifestyle in the rural areas. It wasn't Glendalough or more touristy areas. It was, again, a little bit more rural, but it wasn't completely. And at the time, in the 60s, I have to say, you had a bus coming from Carnew into Tinahely and heading to Arklow every morning at 8 in the morning. Ned Jemison used to drive the bus. and that would connect with another bus. He would connect you to a train or a bus to Dublin in Arklow. Then Ned would be back for lunchtime from Arklow, doing the same route back to Carnew. He would have his lunch there and turn around. He would head back in the evening time. So you had 4 or 5 buses out of town, out of little old Tinnahealy, because people didn't have the transport. David Hanley was responsible for a major protest with CIE when they cut that service. And the reason they cut it was because people now had cars, there were fewer and fewer people using the service, and we went to a stage where, we had buses, as I say, in and out of town. I mean, I remember seeing chickens in bags being delivered on buses, because that was the only way of getting in and out of Tinnahealy to Arklow and then to Dublin. That was all cut in the early 80s, I would think. And David would have been very instrumental, again, bringing his talents and his expertise and confidence to go in and say, right, let's lobby for this. And they fought, but they got nowhere with CIE. They shut it down. And obviously, the commercially it wasn't viable, as is the case in a lot of rural areas. But they didn't. Now we're now back with went to maybe one day a week. You get a bus out of town on a Thursday, and now with the rural local link, that's been a bit of an improvement. But here we are now in 2023, and it's taken a long time to even, meet that need, particularly for elderly people who can no longer drive and young people who might like to go to Carlow for the day. So that local link has been a huge improvement, but that's only around in the last 3 years.
In that respect, what do you see as the big challenges for Tinnahealy in the sort of next decade?
Okay, interesting question. I definitely can see the school expanding. There is planning for 23 houses. Where the playground is and the creche area, just in there. That is land was bought by the council, so there will be development. I could see the school getting bigger, to be honest with you. Challenges, employment. We've a couple of major employers locally, and they've been very loyal to Tinnahealy. APL, the Automatics Plastics Limited, set up by Al Lawless and his wife in, I would say, in the back shed of Pierce's wool shed. Now, Pierce's, old Mrs. Pierce was our landlady who rented the house, the business that my mother started in. We rented that property for many, many years, and eventually the Pierces sold it to my dad when he had enough money saved to buy it. So that Pierce family owned a very big, I talked about the Chambers, but these would have been a Catholic family, and opposite the Chambers on the other side of the street, they had this business, again selling, everything from a needle to an anchor in it, food, groceries, that kind of thing, but they had a wool business as well. So in the later 60s, I think, could be wrong on this now, they were approached by Al Lawless and his wife to set up the starter of a plastics factory. That was injection moulding, when plastics, glasses and bottles and all that were being coming on stream as a new supply of drinking vessels or whatever, and it was all new. This injection moulding was really new. He applied to get help there, and they rented it to him, and then eventually he bought the site, which is just down from the school, and I think they celebrated, did a big 50th celebration, 50 years in business, very loyal to Tinnahealy. His son, whom Frank taught in Avoca, is now the head of the business. He has inherited an island, and his wife are still alive, thank God, and Al sent his children to the school and was a great benefactor of the school. But young Al, as I say, now they've been bought out by an American company called Pro-Am-Pac, I think it is. No, it's not Pro-Am-Pac. There's another one. Pro-Am-Pac has bought another one in Carnew. But anyway, they've been bought out by an American company. So who knows how that will go. But I do know that they have been a consistent employer. They run the factory around the clock, and that's been a mainstay. The other mainstay in the area would be Fitzgerald's Kitchens. owned by Eamon Fitzgerald, a great benefactor of the school. All of these presses you see here, all donated to the school by Eamon. His children came to the school, and he has set up a thriving business, and he is doing rather well. And he's put in for planning to extend. So they were the two major employers in the area. CUPHAT would have been, in former times, a lot of forestry workers here. But I would say employment is probably going to be the biggest challenge, and if they can set up locally, it would sustain the population living locally rather than having to travel,
Do you see perhaps tourism having a role in that?
Definitely. I mean, you've got a product here in Tinnahealy, and when you with Wicklow County Council and the Tourism Board, Tinnahealy is regarded as quite the jewel in the crown of Wicklow. That's why, say, the courthouse has been given massive funding. I mean, the Mermaid in Bray came on stream later, and the Tinnahealy one was the local centre, and it got really good funding to start with because it was one of the very first to start. But I think it's acknowledged county-wise that Tinnahealy has that huge pool of talent that gets behind committees that will apply for the grants, that will get the area developed. You have the Tinnahealy Walks, you have as I say, the courthouse. Going back to Paddy O'Toole's time, Save the Coolatin Woods. Paddy was involved in that with Liam O'Gomweny highlighting it as a musician, and a poet, Very Jerome, I've forgotten his second name, he was involved in it as well. And they basically, woods were going to be cut down but the new owner, long after Fitzwilliam had left it, they were just going to turn it into commercial. So the enterprise, and he appealed to Charlie Haughey at the time, and they really made a national campaign. And they chained themselves to the trees, you name it, they did everything. And we ended up with the Tomlin Oak Wood saved by the state, and it was a wonderful achievement. So from that led on the walks. And again, Paddy would have been a very influential and would have been a former chairman of the Tinnahealy Courthouse, and Frank would have taken over after him. So Paddy would have been a local. He lived locally. I went to college with him. I was in UCD with Paddy. He was a year or two older than me, but his father was a principal in Knockananna, and he would have a great sense of local history, and he would have passed it on to Paddy. Paddy then went on to create his own business through the family home. He has converted it into a wedding venue, and it's an extremely unique wedding venue. It's Ballybeg House, and he's doing really, really well, and has been doing. It's been in business for a good 25 years, I would think, at this stage, maybe even longer. I'm not sure, but it's a really valued premises where you can get married, and fantastic facilities. So, but Paddy would be very much rooted in the area. Again, the original chairman of the courthouse, and again seeing the need to make Tinnahealy a place where people would love to come and visit. The walks, 2007 they were only opened. So when you think of what's happened even in the last 20 years, and it's been huge. I would think maybe more accommodation required locally. That would be a thing to do again, so people can stay locally. The hotel can provide a limited number of beds, B&Bs, that kind of thing, probably need to be developed. Madeline's was a thriving restaurant and has been sold, and that's been bought now, and I think he's providing a lot of beds and accommodation there. So definitely from a tourist point of view, I could see maybe a hostel, because you must remember we're at the end of the Wicklow Way here as well. Technically it's Clonegall, but there's nothing in Clonegall to receive the guests when they finish their walk, so I could see something linking in with that. The Wicklow Way is a huge attraction, because walkers literally come down from Mangans and they're finishing off part of the walk here, so it's extraordinary that the Wicklow Way is finishing in County Carlow, in Clonegall, but again, I could see something develop in that area to help walkers. That's a big area, because walking, as you look around the hills, I mean, just what you're surrounded by, and there is a good relationship, because they had to negotiate, particularly with the Mangles Walk, and there were 3 walks which were developed again. A local committee. My former vice principal here retired 15 years ago. The first thing she threw herself into was developing walks up hills, because she lives up Mangans. So they have 3 different loops, and they're marked out. They're marked, recognised trails. They've been maintained, etc. And again, the walkers can be tied in with the Wicklow Way, but there are individual walks of a certain length, and the most idyllic countryside up there, so maybe a hostel in the area might help, might draw more people in. That's a possibility, but definitely from the walking point of view, from the beauty of the natural landscape, I can see Tinahely being and the lovely river, developing maybe a fishing area in it. I don't know if that would draw more people in. I wouldn't like to see change too much, though.
On that note, what are maybe maybe 2 more questions? What are the big changes? Obviously, you've been here over large periods of your life. What are the big changes you've seen in Tinahely from your childhood to your sort of when you moved back and now to the modern day?
Okay, I suppose from my childhood I would have witnessed poverty and lack of care of children. That doesn't happen anymore. And we talk about child protection. Just doesn't. You don't see a child coming to school like that. Certainly not in this area. I'm sure it happens in other schools, but not in this area, because I suppose there is a good rate of employment locally, etc. The transport situation. No transport back in the 50s and early 60s. Then the railway did actually come as far as where's the railway walk? The old station is down there. Again, built by Lord Fitzwilliam to bring his hunting guests down from Dublin. They would come as far as Rathdrum, and then they take this branch line from Rathdrum through Aughrim into Tinahely. That was closed down probably in the early 40s. That again employed, and I do know in our record in our school, the former principal got, what was it, yellow fever. I forget what was the disease at the time. And the station master in the railway station both died from, whatever, was it yellow fever? I can't think of it at the moment. I probably have to look it up. But that'll just tell you the effects of illness at the time when you weren't inoculated against it. But there was an acting station master up to the late 30s, early 40s. That closed down. The transport situation then, we had the bus put on. Again, that's gone now because of the car, so that's a big change in my lifetime. The quality of life of the people, I would say there's less employed in agriculture, whereas 14-year-olds were taken out of school in my time. They didn't go on to second level. They did maybe, if they were considered good enough, they would do the primary cert, and then they left school at 14. And they could work as farm labourers. That doesn't happen now. Can't. You have to do your leaving cert. So the overall lifting of the education level has been huge in my time. Policing. I pointed out in the photograph there, the police station in Tinahely was right in the centre of the town. I used to play with the local sergeant's daughter, Patricia, and we had great fun going down into the cells, and as children we played in that house. It's now been bought and it's turned into a chipper. But the movement of the police station out of the town into the suburban area was not a good idea, I would have thought, because obviously the major crime is going to be around the area where in my time growing up here, there was a sergeant and at least 3 guards policing the area. But prior to that time, when I was very young, you would probably have about 5. cars. So I mean, and there were the days when you got a fine for not having a light on your bike, like, you know. So there were the fines that people were given. But so when I was growing up, definitely there was a sergeant and probably 3 guards. That was reduced to 2. Now we don't even have a sergeant. We have a guard, and we don't have, and it was round the clock. Whereas now, and you think level of crime has shot up compared to my time growing up. We're now attached to Bolton Glass, and if you've a robbery, you've got to ring through to Bolton Glass, and maybe the local station will be open for those few hours if you're lucky. If not, Bolton Glass have to send out the squad car. So that's a huge retrograde step in a small community like that. And that's a national plan to, you know, take all of these services out nationally, out of small rural areas like the post office. Now we're okay with the post office, but the bank has gone, you know. And again, that's going to have a huge impact, because again, talking about the bank, you know, you came into the town. The bank has only closed about 4 years, but you came into the town, you did your business with the bank manager, you withdrew your cash in the bank or else in the ATM, and then you went to the butchers and you bought, or you went to the shopkeeper and you bought your groceries. Whereas now people can't get money into Tinahely, so they're inclined to go to get the nearest town to get a cash machine, and then they do their shopping outside. And that was a very poor. That's been very, very unhelpful in the town for the business people. Parking is a problem locally as well, because of everything is kind of concentrated in the centre. There's actually no parking. And I know there were meetings with traders locally to see if they could in any way improve it. And one of the things that came up at the meeting was, well, if you look at all the cars that are here every day, there's at least 15 or 20 of them are belonging to the people who work in the shops. So if you're, as a shopkeeper, going to take up all those spaces, that's stopping a space for somebody, for you or me, to go and collect my milk, or, you know. So there's no space to park in Tinahely. We'll drive on to Hackettstown, and that's what happens. There is no parking, so that's a big issue, and that would be a big issue from a tourism point of view as well, you know. So policing, definitely retrograde step.
Maybe some of the positive changes, like you mentioned some policing's gone down, you know, like parking, but you also mentioned the quality of life.
Oh, there's no doubt
about it. Are there any other
about
sort of really positive ways that Tinahely is sort of on the rise? So
absolutely. Oh, the standard of living has shot up. The level of education has shot up. Oh no, there's so many positives. And employment locally, you know, and again, that only really all happened in the, you know, late 60s, early 70s, and an estate was built when I was a young teacher first, called Derry Drive, and that again generated a lot of the young people, and the numbers in the school rose, because again that came to maturity, and that's still there now. And we have still a lot of children coming. There's been a fair bit of development locally as well, housing close to the school. I know the field next to the school is actually, from what I gather, is earmarked for education. So down the line, if a secondary school, because I know Carnew is bursting at the seams, they have over 1,000 pupils, and they just keep building and building on. Yeah, it's huge. So, you know, and we're busing children into Carnew, and they just can't, it's not sustainable. So maybe down to, you know, when I'm dead and gone, there will be a secondary school here that would, you know, look after the needs of this area. Hackettstown is definitely on the rise. That as a school, the new principal in there, Alan Costello, and he's really working hard to build up the school and the reputation of the school. And this year, for the first time ever, I think we have well over half of our 6th class going to Hackettstown. They would always have all gone to Carnew, but Carnew is having difficulty with numbers now, and the smaller school is seen as more suitable for children coming from a small rural area, you know. So they were the major pluses and minuses. Lighting in the town. I mean, when we would walk up the hill, there used to be a local youth club called Mochran and Tuacha, and in the what we call the old school, which was in the Fever Hospital, we would have our meetings there once a week, and we would come up the hill in darkness because there was no street lighting. So it's a simple thing, but street lighting has improved the quality of life. And again, that's down to our councils who have invested the taxes and provided lighting. Rural Ireland was not electrified until the early 30s, so in the 60s in Tinahely it was a dark place, there was a lot of darkness around, so lighting, basic as that. There's road surfaces, a huge improvement, so made it more feasible for driving. Parishes, looking at the parish here, it's quite a thriving parish, and it's the most northerly parish of the Diocese of Ferns. If you think of Wexford, from southern Wexford, and little old Tinahely is right up at the very top. So it's the most northerly parish, but it has been traditionally a very thriving parish. What they would have had in former times, you would have had a parish priest, you would have had a curate living in his own house, parish priest living in his house, and then you would have housekeepers in both houses. You would have maybe, and going way back, because we buried a lady who used to work in the parish house, and the homily that they were talking about her life growing up, and another lady used to work in the local parish house, doing all the kitchen gardening, looking after the hens, whatever. It was very much a thriving kind of parish house where there was workers in the garden, on the farm around it. That's all changed. We're now down to one parish priest, no curates. The curate's house has been sold. No curates. So we're down to one ageing parish priest. So going forward, I think that's not sustainable. And the Catholic, the Diocese of Ferns cannot supply new priests because there's a shortfall in vocations. There's really nobody going forward. So that's going to be a major change going forward in the area. And it was a well-subscribed parish church down through the years. We've, 2 to 3 people locally would have become priests and would have been ordained here. The bishop would have come and ordained them, and I'm involved in the local church choir, so down to the years we sang for every event like that in the church, jubilee celebrations. So it's thriving and has been, but because of the decline of Catholic Church, we're in a different era now, and the laity will have to move in there and take over. There's no doubt, if it's to continue in some form, but if there's a need.
Before I ask sort of the final question that I sort of used to wrap everything up, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you'd like to talk about?
I've rambled on quite a lot, so I don't think there's anything now that's coming to mind now. I'm sure as this interview is over, I'll probably think I should have said that, or I should have, and nothing else has come to my mind at the moment. No, I don't think so.
In that case, I might wrap up with this. It's a very broad-ranging question. I think you've touched on a few things already, but perhaps in a really holistic sense, what does it mean to you to be from Tinahely and to be living in Tinahely?
Oh, everything that I've spoken just absolutely will back up the sheer joy I have of having the privilege to have lived here all my life. And come back and contribute to the community in the best way I could possibly be, because to me community is at the heart of everything, and to be in a community where I could be involved. Actually, there's one thing now that you mentioned about not talking about, and actually I'd forgotten about it, but it's just come to my mind. When we were rearing our children, our first daughter, who's now 39, living in Vienna with our 2 lovely grandchildren, there was no creche in the area. We didn't have any childcare, there was no need for it, because basically the mothers stayed at home and looked after the children. So I know that when Quiva was little, we got together mothers, and we set up a little area in the what was then the new community hall that David Hanley was on the committee to. And we were allowed into the kitchen area, and we'd set up a little preschool mother and toddler thing, and we'd set up activities for the children for them to meet before they went to school. And then we had a very, again, this is another example of an inspiring person come into the community. Trish Gallagher and her husband Jim came from Dalkey. They came, I would say, probably in the, mid-70s. And they reared their children here, 5 children. And Jim was a carpenter, electrician. But again, coming from outside into a community like this, they contributed. Jim started the first soccer club. And I mean, back then, GA was the only sport. So to start a soccer club was just pioneering, right? Trish was the housekeeper for the former parish priest, and she had her 5 children. And she worked for the Bank of Ireland in Dublin, and she came into the community and again brought her skills. Trish said, we have to get a preschool for our children, because there's, not a preschool, but a place where they would get a little preparation for school when they go, and that they would meet their other little pals, and so going to school on the first day wouldn't be such a wrench. And she'd seen that in Dublin, that her kid, when she was little, she could avail of it. It wasn't here. She saw the need. So she got us going, and we started, and we absolutely had to beg the local committee of this community hall to give us the 40 by 20 foot space underneath the stage area of the community hall, so we could drain it, plaster it, put in electricity, and make it into a preschool, our first one. It's underneath the ground, right? But we put in ramps. We got our first fall scheme. My very good friend that I walk with every day kind of oversaw it really with her other colleagues under the fall scheme to develop it as a preschool area. And being so close to the school, it was ideal. So we mothers came each morning, and you'd pay so much per morning to have your child looked after on a volunteering basis. And I'm talking now, she was born in 83, so I'm talking 86, and we would help each other out. And this is again the local community coming together to say, we have a need here, we need to do this. Now mind you, when we went to the committee, a very esteemed local woman on the committee, who's now long since deceased, a mother of 13, said, what do you want with the play school? Sure, I reared 13, I didn't need it, So that was the mindset you were up against, right? But nevertheless, we fought. We got our licence. But this is the story about Trish and Jim. Back in the mid-80s, money very tight, and recessionary times. Jim wanted to build on an extra room because they had a 5th child, and they were living in a cottage in Rivendell, just outside of town, and went to the local bank to see could he get £5,000 to build on the room. He could do the electrics. All he wanted was for the materials. Because he was unemployed and self-employed, should I say, and Trish was working for the local parish, so she wasn't getting a huge amount of money, and they had all these children. They weren't going to give him 5,000, so he said, right, we're packing up, we're leaving. And they left for New Zealand. And New Zealand's gain was Tinhealy's loss, because these were 2 people who had so much to give in the community. Didn't have personal wealth, but gave so much as volunteers. But we had a send-off party down in Murphy's for Trish. I'll never forget the night she left, 87, I think 88. And she said, don't let that licence go, keep it up. And she was determined, and wanted us to keep going to make sure that we got the area developed, because it wasn't done before she left, but we got it developed, and we got everything in there, and it was a beautiful area, lovely area. My children went to that preschool, and we eventually could afford to employ a permanent person with the funds that we made from the parents. We got nothing from the state. We were there for about 20 years, and we kept applying for capital funding to build, and I was the chairperson of the committee, whatever, for all those years. And we got a local girl, and we could pay her kind of a salary that we could say from the funds that we got from the parents. And she started the process of the paperwork to apply for grant aided funding, because Tinhealy was identified as a black spot for childcare. There was nothing in the area. And yet they knew we were a volunteer committee, 20 years in operation, so we had a record of sustainability. So they dealt with us, and with Julie Byrne, she applied, and we were turned down the first time, and we applied again, and we were turned down, and then the third time we were turned down. So when the crash came in 2007, we got the funding. We were granted 1.2 million to build a community preschool, wraparound care. This was to cater for the number of people who were leaving Tinnahealy to go to work outside, and they needed childcare. Not what we were supplying, which was just the 3 hours in the morning, volunteering mothers and all that. So again, we saw the need. So I got the phone call to say, yeah, we've been approved. What do I do with 1.2 million? I have to ring a former past pupil of mine, Eugene O'Neill, who is an accountant, who was working for Crown Roofing in Roundwood. I said, Eugene, I have just got news that we've received this money. Any chance we could get you on board? And of course, to say to an accountant, we have 1.2 million to start the budget. He said, Chief, of course I get involved, and like I taught Eugene, he was my past pupil, And so he came on board, and of course with his building expertise and working in Crown Roofing, we went to tender, got a really good architect, and we built a wraparound, and this was built eventually by 2010. So we have a lovely facility. You'll see it as you come to the school. If you go down by the community hall, in at the back, we got parish land from the local parish, and we bought it from them at a very knockdown price, and we built our own preschool. And my big thing, from all the years I've been involved in this for 30, I'm still chairman of the board, but anyway, was that it would not be a private enterprise that would come in, that this would be a community, because I saw the need for children that could never afford to go to a preschool. They need to be able to do that, and that's what we got. It was money by Pobble that we got to build a community play school that every child could avail of and pay a little or as much as they could afford. So we have had 3 managers. Jackie's the present manager, works really well. Eugene is involved in the accounts over there. He's my accountant on my board of management here. He was the accountant on the courthouse for a number of years when Frank was involved. Again, people bringing their skills. He's a local man, and he's given his skills to the community, again, for free, no charge. And that is a thriving preschool now, and the children can be dropped off at 7:30 in the morning and picked up at 6 in the evening. Personally, as a mother, not the most ideal, in an ideal world where you didn't have to do that, but it's meeting a need, and there are wonderful staff in there. They get fed, they get breakfast clubs, they do after school care, they pick them up here and they bring them in at the back of the school into school every morning, and they collect them here and bring them back. So I got a number of what they call summer works programs in the school, whereby the children could be walk pathways. So we built pathways and steps down to connect with the preschool, so that the children never had to go out on the road, and the staff just came in the back way. So connecting the two. So we have our own primary school and our preschool, and that's, if you ask me what I wanted to mention, that's something that I had forgotten about. But I think that has lifted up the area so much, because it has provided the possibility for people to actually have childcare and continue to work and continue in their careers, So, and of course, God, the benefit to the children coming in junior infants. I mean, these kids are socialised, compared to when I started teaching first. I mean, the wails and tears of children leaving their mothers at the gate, first separation, whereas this is done from 3 or 2 years. Actually, they take them in, they don't take the babies, from 2 onwards up, and these children can come and get a wonderful preschool education now, because again, that's all been upgraded, and they have a whole curriculum in there, and it's preparing these children for this level, So that's been a huge benefit to the children. And what I love about it is, if your father's unemployed and your mother's unemployed, can avail of that facility, and it's like a levelling. If your mother can pay top dollar for it, it's a community service, but you're wearing the same uniform, you're sitting at the same breakfast table, and it's a levelling and it's bringing all levels up. And that for me is wonderful in a community, and that's why I'm so glad we never had a private operated a preschool in the area, because it's community is where it's at.
I might indulge in one last question.
Yes.
Right back in the beginning, you talked about your father, being a landscape painter and talking about the beauty of this area. If you had to take someone from outside the area to one to your favourite places, not just in the village but around the area, where would you take them?
Where would I take them? I would think the walks. Mangan's Walk is just, you have a bird's eye view of the village for starters. Haddon's Hill, the top of that hill you can see out there, magnificent views. And then for the less abled, definitely the walks, the Tomnafinnog walks, the railway walk. I walk it every morning. It's just fabulous, there are so many places, the courthouse. But the favourite I would come out on. My father walked those hills. He stalked deer on those hills. And my brother stalked deer on those hills, and and again, it was never for sport, it was just for food, so it would be very close to my heart, and when we do bring our friends here, we head up Mangans. Let's go to Mangans for a walk, let's go to Tomnafinnog, depending on the ability of the walkers, But anyway, it's a pleasure to live here, and it's a pleasure to talk to you and explain a little bit about where I have grown up, and to share it with you, because when I just listen to myself speaking, I realise I have been privileged and enriched to have been brought up in such a lovely area, and to be able to live here hopefully into my retirement and beyond for many, many years, because it is a truly beautiful place to live in. So thank you for supporting me in telling that story.
Of course. No,
so important to tell those stories.
Yeah. No, thank you for telling it. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chris.